December 21, 1978. Night falls over Pago Pago, American Samoa. A single-engine Cessna 188 sits on the tarmac, its agricultural spray tanks retrofitted as auxiliary fuel containers. Inside the cockpit, Jay Prochnow runs through his pre-flight checks one more time. In front of him, 475 nautical miles of open Pacific Ocean. His destination, Norfolk Island, a speck of land barely 5 miles long in an ocean that covers 1/3 of the Earth's surface. His navigation equipment, an automatic direction finder taped to the top of his instrument panel with duct tape, a compass, some paper charts, and 14 years of flying experience from his days as a United States Navy pilot. The math is simple. The stakes are absolute. If the wind calculations are wrong by just a few degrees, if the heading drifts by a handful of compass points, if anything goes even slightly off course over the next 14 hours, Jay will fly past Norfolk Island and never see it. And when the fuel runs out over empty ocean, that will be the end of the story. But Jay Prochnow isn't thinking about that right now. He's thinking about the deal he made back in San Francisco. 2 Cessna 188 ag wagons, crop dusters really, sold to a buyer in Australia for a handsome price. The catch? Delivery included. Someone had to fly these planes across the Pacific, island hopping through Hawaii, American Samoa, Norfolk, and finally to the Australian mainland. In the middle of an economic crisis with money tight and opportunities scarce, Jay found a partner willing to fly the second Cessna in formation. Safety in numbers. If one plane went down, the other could call for help. Guide rescuers to the position. That was the plan. 24 hours ago, that plan disintegrated on this very runway. Jay had watched it happen from his cockpit. His partner, positioned ahead of him on the takeoff roll, had pushed the throttle forward. The Cessna's single engine roared to life. The aircraft accelerated down the runway, laden with fuel, heavy beyond its normal operating weight. And then, just as the nose wheel began to lift, something went wrong. The angle was too steep, the speed too slow, the weight distribution off by just enough. The aircraft stalled before it could climb, dropped back onto the runway, skidded forward, and slammed into the threshold barrier. Jay had aborted his own takeoff immediately, brought his Cessna to a stop, and sprinted across the tarmac. His partner crawled out of the wreckage shaken but unharmed. The aircraft, however, was destroyed. The partnership effectively was over. Standing beside the crumpled fuselage in the tropical heat, his partner had made a simple calculation. Going forward alone meant risking everything. Going back meant losing everything they'd already invested: fuel costs, landing fees, weeks of their lives spent hopscotching across the Pacific. "If we don't deliver these planes," his partner had said, "we don't get paid. And we've already spent almost everything we had just getting here." Jay had spent that night staring at navigation charts, running the numbers over and over. 14 hours. Solo. No backup. No second pair of eyes to verify calculations. No wingman to call for help if the ADF failed or the compass drifted or the winds pushed him off course. Just him. A single-engine crop duster. And an ocean that had swallowed better pilots in better planes. But the numbers didn't lie. He'd made this calculation before, during his Navy days. Risk versus necessity. Fear versus duty. And in the cold arithmetic of survival, the equation was clear. He either flew, or he lost everything. At first light on December 21st, Jay Prochnow pushed the throttle forward and pointed his Cessna toward the horizon. The flight plan was straightforward in theory, brutal in execution. Pago Pago to Norfolk Island, 1,475 nautical miles across open ocean with no visual landmarks, no radar coverage, no GPS satellites watching from orbit. In 1978, GPS was still a military experiment, years away from civilian use. Air navigation over water relied on 3 things: dead reckoning, celestial navigation, and radio direction finding. Dead reckoning meant calculating your position based on time, speed, and heading, essentially flying blind and hoping your math was correct. Celestial navigation meant using a sextant to measure the angle of the sun or stars above the horizon, then referencing tables to determine your latitude and longitude. That worked fine for ships moving at 15 knots with stable decks and trained navigators. It worked considerably less well for a pilot flying solo in a vibrating cockpit at 120 knots, trying to hold a sextant steady while simultaneously controlling the aircraft. which left the automatic direction finder, the ADF, as Jay's primary lifeline. The ADF was beautifully simple technology. You tuned it to a known radio frequency, usually an AM broadcast station or a non-directional beacon, and a needle on your instrument panel would point toward the transmitter. If you kept the needle centered, you'd fly directly toward the signal source. The ADF at Norfolk Island had a range of more than 200 nautical miles. Even if Jay's calculations were off, even if the winds pushed him north or south of his intended track, once he got within 200 miles of Norfolk, the ADF would lock onto the beacon and guide him home. That was the theory. Jay had secured his ADF unit to the top of the instrument panel with duct tape. Not ideal, but the Cessna 188 wasn't designed for long-range navigation. It was a crop duster, built to fly low and slow over farmland, dispensing chemicals over fields. The instrument panel had space for the basics: airspeed, altitude, compass, engine gauges, but not much else. The ADF was an aftermarket edition, mounted where space allowed, secured with whatever worked. For the first 12 hours, it worked perfectly. Jay maintained his heading, monitored his fuel consumption, adjusted for crosswinds. The Pacific stretched endlessly in every direction: blue water, blue sky, the horizon a perfect circle where the two met. Hours passed. The sun climbed, peaked, began its descent. Jay ate a sandwich, drank water from a canteen, shifted in his seat trying to find a position that didn't make his back ache. The Cessna's seat wasn't designed for comfort. It was designed to be bolted to an airframe and provide basic support during short flights over farmland. Sitting in it for 14 hours straight felt like sitting on a wooden church pew. Uncomfortable after 30 minutes, agonizing after 3 hours, and by hour 12, actively painful. But the pain was manageable. Discomfort was expected. What mattered was staying on course, maintaining airspeed, conserving fuel. At the 13-hour mark, Jay tuned his ADF to Norfolk Island's beacon frequency. The needle swung immediately, pointing straight ahead. Relief flooded through him. The calculations were correct. The winds had been kind. He was on course. 30 more minutes and he'd see the island. 30 minutes and he could land, stretch his legs, sleep in a real bed. 30 minutes passed. No island. Jay scanned the horizon. Water. Nothing but water. He checked his calculations again. Speed, time, distance, everything matched. He should be passing over Norfolk Island right now. But there was no island. Just endless blue ocean. The ADF needle still pointed straight ahead. Maybe the headwind was stronger than he'd calculated. Maybe he was still 10 or 15 minutes out. Jay kept flying, kept watching, kept waiting for that first glimpse of land. 10 minutes, 15, 20, still no island. And then the ADF needle began to swing. Slowly at first, just a few degrees left, then right, then faster, wandering, drifting, spinning without conviction, pointing everywhere and nowhere. Jay's stomach dropped. He grabbed his chart, found frequencies for other islands, Fiji, Tonga, backup beacons he'd noted during flight planning. He tuned the ADF to the first frequency. The needle spun. He tried the second frequency. The needle wandered. He cycled through every frequency on his chart, and with each attempt, the reality became clearer. The ADF had failed, not gradually, not with warning. It had simply stopped working. Somewhere in the middle of the largest ocean on Earth, with Jay Prochnow now somewhere within a search area of thousands of square miles. For a moment, just a moment, panic threatened to overwhelm him. He forced it down. Navy training kicked in. Assess the situation, identify the problem, execute the solution. The situation: lost over the Pacific, position unknown. The problem: no navigation instruments, fuel running low. The solution: declare an emergency and execute a square search pattern. Jay reached for his high-frequency radio. HF radio could transmit over hundreds of miles, reaching air traffic control stations even when you were far from land. He keyed the microphone. Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is Cessna November 771. I am lost, approximately 14 hours out of Pago Pago, destination Norfolk Island. Automatic direction finder has failed. Position unknown. Fuel remaining approximately 2 hours. Request immediate assistance. The radio crackled. Then a voice, professional and calm, from Auckland Air Traffic Control. Cessna 771, Auckland Control. We copy your mayday. Stand by. Jay began his square search pattern. Fly straight for 5 minutes, turn 90 degrees. Fly straight for 5 minutes, turn 90 degrees. Repeat. Expand. Each leg of the square slightly longer than the last. It was a search and rescue technique designed to cover as much area as possible when you didn't know your exact position. The theory was sound. In practice, it meant burning precious fuel to fly in circles over empty ocean, hoping to stumble across an island that could be anywhere within a 200-mile radius of his current position. Time became elastic. Minutes felt like hours. The sun continued its arc across the sky, indifferent to his predicament. Jay monitored his fuel gauges, calculated his remaining endurance, adjusted his throttle to the leanest possible mixture, running the engine on the bare minimum of fuel to stay aloft. Every minute he could stretch his fuel was another minute for rescue to arrive, another minute to find land, another minute to survive. He tried not to think about what ditching in the Pacific would mean. He'd done water survival training in the Navy. He knew the statistics. In water this deep, this far from land, with no emergency beacon, no flotation gear beyond his life vest, the odds of being found were effectively zero. The ocean would swallow him the same way it had swallowed countless others. Auckland Control came back on the radio. Cessna 771. We have contacted all aircraft in your vicinity. Stand by. All aircraft in your vicinity. Jay understood what that meant. In the middle of the Pacific, there weren't many aircraft. Commercial flights followed established routes between major cities, staying within range of airports. A lone Cessna, hundreds of miles from any commercial corridor, was flying through what was essentially empty sky. The odds of someone being close enough to help were slim. 400 miles to the north, Captain Gordon Vette settled into the left seat of Air New Zealand Flight 103, a McDonnell Douglas DC-10, registered as ZKNZS. The big Trije sat at the gate in Nadi, Fiji, preparing for a routine 2-hour flight to Auckland, New Zealand. It was late afternoon, December 21st, 1978. The pre-Christmas travel season was in full swing. The passenger manifest showed 88 people on board, families heading home for the holidays, business travelers wrapping up year-end trips, tourists returning from tropical vacations. Gordon Vette was 55 years old, with decades of flying experience spanning military and commercial aviation. He'd joined what was then Tasman Empire Airways Limited as an engineering apprentice at 15, learned to fly at Auckland Aero Club, spent 5 years in the Royal New Zealand Air Force as a flight instructor, then returned to what had become Air New Zealand and worked his way up through the ranks. By 1978, he held licenses as both a pilot and a navigator, a relatively rare combination in commercial aviation. Most pilots knew basic navigation, but few had the advanced training in celestial navigation and radio positioning that Vette had earned during his military years. Beside him, First Officer Arthur Dovey ran through the pre-departure checklist. Behind them, Flight Engineer Gordon Brooks monitored the DC-10's 3 General Electric CF6 turbofan engines, each producing 51,000 pounds of thrust. The DC-10 was a long-range wide body, capable of flying 6,200 nautical miles with a full load. For a 2-hour hop across the Pacific, it was overpowered, overcapable. Exactly the kind of aircraft you wanted when flying over water. The pre-flight routine was second nature. Check flight controls, verify fuel quantity, confirm hydraulics, test electrical systems. Everything on the DC-10 was redundant, multiple backup systems for every critical function. If one navigation system failed, 2 others could take over. If an engine failed, 2 remained. The aircraft was designed to handle failures, to keep flying even when things went wrong, which made it particularly well suited for what was about to happen. The departure was smooth. Flight 103 lifted off from Nadi, climbed through 10,000 feet, leveled at cruise altitude, and settled into the routine rhythm of a Pacific crossing. The sun was setting behind them, painting the western horizon in shades of orange and red. Ahead, darkness gathered over the ocean. 40 minutes into the flight, the HF radio crackled. Auckland Air Traffic Control, their voice slightly distorted by the distance. Air New Zealand 103, Auckland Control. Vette keyed his microphone. Auckland Control, Air New Zealand 103, go ahead. 103, we have an emergency situation. A light aircraft, Cessna November 771, has declared Mayday approximately 1,400 miles northeast of Norfolk Island. The aircraft is lost with navigation failure and low fuel. You are currently the only aircraft in the vicinity. Can you assist? Vette exchanged glances with Dovey. The request was unusual. Commercial airliners didn't typically divert to search for lost aircraft. That was the job of military search and rescue units, Coast Guard helicopters, specialized SAR aircraft with trained crews and proper equipment. A DC-10 with 88 passengers wasn't designed for this kind of mission, but the key phrase was, the only aircraft in the vicinity. If Air New Zealand Flight 103 didn't help, no one would. At least not in time. Vette made his decision in seconds. Auckland Control 103. We can assist, but I need to consult with my passengers first. He unbuckled his harness, stood, and walked into the passenger cabin. 88 faces turned toward him. Businessmen in suits, families with children, elderly couples, solo travelers. They'd paid for a 2-hour flight to Auckland. They had connections to make, people waiting at the airport, Christmas plans that depended on arriving on time. Vette kept his explanation simple and direct. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Gordon Vette, and I'm your captain this evening. I need to inform you of a situation that's developed. A pilot flying alone across the Pacific has become lost. His navigation equipment has failed. He's running low on fuel. Air traffic control has asked if we can help search for him. If we agree to do this, our arrival in Auckland will be delayed, possibly by several hours. I want to be clear. This is not a normal part of our flight, but we are currently the only aircraft in range that can help. I'm asking for your permission to divert from our planned route and assist in this search. If anyone objects, please let me know now. Silence filled the cabin. Then a woman near the front spoke up. How much fuel does he have left? Approximately 2 hours, Vette replied. And if we don't help him, he'll have to ditch in the ocean. His chances of survival after that are very low. The woman nodded. Then we should help him. A murmur of agreement rippled through the cabin. One by one, passengers nodded, spoke up, raised their hands. A businessman near the back said, I'll miss my connection, but it's just a flight. Do what you need to do. A mother with 2 young children added, I want my kids to remember this. That when someone needed help, we helped. Not a single passenger objected. Vette returned to the cockpit. He keyed the radio. Auckland Control, Air New Zealand 103. We have passenger consensus. We are diverting to assist Cessna 771. 103 Auckland Control copies. We're patching you through to the Cessna on HF frequency. Stand by. A moment later, a new voice filled Vette's headset. Strained, tired, but controlled. This is Cessna November 771. To whoever's listening, I'm lost somewhere over the Pacific. My ADF failed. I have approximately 1 hour 45 minutes of fuel remaining. I'm flying a square search pattern, but I have no idea where Norfolk Island is. If anyone can hear me, I need help. Vette recognized the tone. He'd heard it before in pilots facing impossible situations. The forced calm that came from training, the professional detachment that kept panic at bay. Jay Prochnow was scared, exhausted, and running out of time. But he was still thinking, still flying, still fighting. Cessna 771, this is Air New Zealand Flight 103, Captain Gordon Vette. We're a DC-10 about 400 miles from your last known position. We're coming to find you, but I need you to do exactly what I tell you. Can you do that? A pause. Then, yes, sir, I can do that. Good. First question. Do you have any visual landmarks? Any ships? Any lights? Anything at all? Negative. Just water. Nothing but water. Understood. Second question. How much navigation equipment do you have that's still working? Compass, airspeed indicator, altimeter, everything else is dead or unreliable. Vette glanced at the instrument panel in front of him. The DC-10 had 3 inertial navigation systems, each one tracking the aircraft's position with extraordinary precision. He knew exactly where his aircraft was at every moment. The Cessna, by contrast, was somewhere in an area roughly the size of Texas, with no way to determine its own position, finding that Cessna would require more than radar or radio triangulation. It would require navigation techniques that predated modern aviation, methods used by sailors centuries ago when they crossed oceans using only the stars, the sun, and a compass. Vette had studied those methods. He'd trained in celestial navigation during his years in the Royal New Zealand Air Force. He'd practiced with sextants, calculated positions using sun angles and star charts, learned how to determine latitude and longitude without GPS or radio beacons. He'd never expected to use those skills to save someone's life. Behind him, Flight Engineer Brooks spoke quietly. "Captain, if we're going to search for this guy, we need to know where to start. How do we find one small plane in the middle of the Pacific with no radar contact?" Vette didn't answer immediately. He was thinking about geometry, about astronomy, about the simple fact that Earth was a sphere rotating through space with the sun as a fixed reference point. He was thinking about how ancient mariners had used nothing more than the angle of the sun to determine their latitude. He was thinking about how that same principle could work in reverse, how two aircraft at different positions would see the sun at different angles, and how those angles could reveal their relative positions. He was thinking about turning his hand into a sextant. But first he needed to narrow down the search area. He needed to know if the Cessna was north or south of his position, east or west. He needed to transform an impossible search into a manageable one. "Cessna 771, Vette said into the radio. "I need you to do something for me. Point your aircraft directly at the sun, fly straight toward it. When your nose is pointing exactly at the sun, tell me your magnetic compass heading." A pause, then, "You want me to fly toward the sun?" "Exactly. Point your nose at the sun and give me the heading." Another pause. Vette could imagine Jay Prochnow in his cockpit, exhausted after 14 hours of flying, now being asked to execute what must sound like an insane request. But the response came clear and steady. "Heading is 274 degrees magnetic." Vette turned to Dovey. "Turn us toward the sun." The DC-10 banked gently. The sun, now low on the horizon, filled the cockpit windows with golden light. When the aircraft steadied, Vette checked the heading indicator. 270 degrees, he said. Dovey looked at him. "What does that tell us?" "It tells us he's south of our position. He's seeing the sun at 274, we're seeing it at 270. We're 4 degrees apart. That means he's somewhere below us, latitude-wise. But how far east or west?" "That," Vette said, "is the next question." He keyed the radio again. "Cessna 771, I need you to do something else. This is going to sound strange, but trust me. I need you to extend your arm straight out in front of you, keeping it fully extended. Then I need you to close your fist and hold it horizontally like you're gripping a handlebar. Point your arm at the horizon, so your fist is sitting right on the horizon line. Then count how many fist widths it takes to reach from the horizon up to the sun. You're going to use your fist as a measuring tool. Understand?" Silence on the radio. Vette could imagine the confusion. Then, "You want me to measure the sun with my fist?" "With your fist, yes. And then with your fingers. Extend your arm, hold your fist horizontally on the horizon and count how many fist widths to the sun." Another pause. Then, "It's about 1 fist and 4 fingers." Vette extended his own arm, closed his fist, held it against the horizon visible through the DC-10's windscreen. The sun was lower in his sky, closer to the horizon. 2 fingers, he said to Dovey. Then, into the radio. "Cessna 771, I've got 2 fingers. You've got 1 fist and 4 fingers. That means you're seeing the sun higher in the sky than I am, which means you're closer to the sun, farther west than our position." "I don't understand," came Jay's voice. "How does that help?" "It means you're southwest of us, approximately 200 to 250 miles away, southwest of our current position. We're coming to get you." Vette turned to Dovey. "Bring us around to 220 degrees. We're going southwest." As the DC-10 banked, Vette leaned back in his seat. The geometry was elegant in its simplicity. Every degree of longitude corresponded to roughly 60 nautical miles at this latitude. The difference in the sun's elevation, measured in fist widths and finger widths, translated directly to angular distance. It wasn't precise, but it didn't need to be. It narrowed the search area from thousands of square miles to hundreds. Now they just had to get close enough to establish radio contact on VHF, the short-range radio with a maximum range of about 200 nautical miles. Once they were within VHF range, they could triangulate Jay's exact position using radio signal strength and direction. But that would take time. And time was the one resource Jay Prochnow was running out of. In the Cessna cockpit, alone over an empty ocean, Jay watched the sun sink toward the horizon. He'd been flying for more than 15 hours. His back ached, his legs were cramping. His fuel gauges showed less than an hour remaining. And somewhere out there, getting closer with every passing minute, a DC-10 full of people who'd agreed to delay their own journey, to sacrifice their time, their comfort, their Christmas plans, was flying through the darkness to find him. He just had to stay in the air long enough for them to arrive. He reduced his throttle to the absolute minimum, leaning the fuel mixture until the engine ran rough, then enriching it just slightly, balancing on the edge of engine failure to squeeze every possible minute from his remaining fuel. The sun touched the horizon. Darkness gathered, and in the growing night, over the vast emptiness of the Pacific Ocean, two aircraft, one massive, one tiny, flew toward each other through the dark. The Pacific Ocean at twilight is a study in contrasts. Above, the sky transitions through gradients of blue, cobalt at the zenith fading to powder blue at the horizon. Below, the water mirrors those colors, reflecting what little light remains. In that liminal space between day and night, two aircraft occupied vastly different realities. Inside the DC-10, Captain Gordon Vette sat surrounded by redundancy. 3 inertial navigation systems tracked position within meters. 3 engines provided thrust. Hydraulic systems, electrical systems, flight controls. Everything had backups, and those backups had backups. The aircraft carried enough fuel to reach Auckland with reserves remaining. The cockpit was pressurized, climate-controlled, ergonomically designed. If one system failed, 2 others would compensate. The DC-10 was a fortress of reliability. 4 fingers extended at arm's length. Roughly 8 degrees of arc. Each degree at this latitude represented approximately 60 nautical miles. The math suggested Jay Prochnow was somewhere between 200 and 250 nautical miles southwest of the DC-10's current position. It was an estimate, crude by modern standards, but it narrowed the search area from impossible to merely improbable. Vette checked his watch. The sun would set completely in approximately 90 minutes. Once darkness fell, visual search would become exponentially harder. They needed to establish VHF radio contact before then. VHF, very high-frequency radio, had a maximum range of roughly 200 nautical miles, limited by the curvature of the Earth and line-of-sight propagation. When 2 aircraft moved within VHF range, they could communicate on frequencies not accessible to other traffic, allowing clearer coordination. More importantly, VHF range could be used to triangulate position. Cessna 771, Vette transmitted on HF. We're heading southwest toward your estimated position. I need you to stop your square search pattern and fly in tight circles. Keep your turns small, maybe a mile diameter. We need you to stay in one spot while we locate you. Jay Prochnow's voice came back, strained but controlled. You want me to fly in circles? If I'm flying in circles, I'm not searching for Norfolk. You're not going to find Norfolk by searching, Vette said, keeping his tone matter-of-fact. Your ADF is dead. You could fly right past the island and never see it. Trust me. Fly small circles, maintain your altitude, and conserve your fuel. We're coming to you. A long pause, then. Roger. Flying circles. Vette could only imagine what Jay was thinking. 15 hours in the air, lost over open ocean, fuel gauges dropping toward empty, and now some voice on the radio was telling him to abandon the search, fly in circles, and wait. It required an extraordinary act of faith. Faith in a stranger's navigation skills, faith in techniques that sounded like they belonged in a history book rather than a modern cockpit. But Jay Prochnow was a Navy pilot. He understood chain of command. When someone with more information gave you an order, you followed it, even when it made no sense. Especially when it made no sense. 25 minutes passed. The DC-10 maintained heading 220 degrees southwest, closing the distance at 450 knots. Then Vette keyed his VHF radio, the short-range system, and transmitted, Cessna 771 Air New Zealand 103 on VHF. Do you read? Static. 5 more minutes. Cessna 771 Air New Zealand 103 on VHF. Radio check. Still static. Arthur Dovey glanced at Vette. If he's really 250 miles out, we're still too far for VHF. Then we keep flying, Vette said. Behind them, flight engineer Gordon Brooks monitored fuel consumption. The DC-10 had departed Nadi with enough fuel for the 2-hour flight to Auckland plus reserves. Every minute they spent searching was a minute subtracted from those reserves. Eventually, they'd reach a decision point. The point where they'd have to abandon the search and proceed to Auckland or divert to an alternate airport. Brooks hadn't mentioned that point yet, but it was coming. 15 more minutes. Then, faint but unmistakable through the VHF static, New Zealand. This is Cessna 771, you there? Vette felt a surge of relief. Cessna 771, we have you on VHF. That means you're within 200 miles. We're getting close. Now came the clever part. VHF radio has a predictable range based on altitude and power output. At their respective altitudes, the DC-10 at 35,000 feet, the Cessna at approximately 8,000 feet, VHF contact meant the two aircraft were roughly 200 nautical miles apart. If Vette could measure the point where they first established contact, then fly for a known distance until they lost contact, then re-establish contact from a different direction, he could create a geometric pattern that would reveal Jay's position. The technique was called oral boxing, using radio signal strength and contact or loss points to draw invisible boxes around the target, narrowing the search area with each iteration. Cessna 771, Vette transmitted. Keep transmitting. Say anything. Count numbers if you want. Just keep your radio transmitting so we can track signal strength. Jay's voice came through, uncertain. Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4. The DC-10 continued southwest. Jay counted. The VHF signal grew stronger, less static, clearer audio. Then, after 20 minutes, the signal began to fade. 12:43, 12:44, 12:40. The transmission cut into static. We just lost him, Dovey said. Vette checked the navigation display, noted their position. Mark that point. Now we turn perpendicular and fly until we re-establish contact. The DC-10 banked, turning 90 degrees to a new heading. They flew for 30 minutes, 180 nautical miles at their current speed. Then Vette tried VHF again. Cessna 771, Air New Zealand 103. Do you read? Nothing. They continued. Another 10 minutes. Cessna 771, this is 103 on VHF. Faint. Barely audible. Read you. Barely. Contact, Vette said. Mark this point. Over the next hour, they repeated the process 3 more times, flying precisely measured distances, marking the points where VHF contact was established and lost, building a geometric picture of where Jay Prochnow's Cessna must be located. Each contact point defined the edge of a circle with a 200-mile radius. Where those circles intersected, that was Jay's position. Vette sketched the pattern on his navigation chart, drawing circles, finding the intersection. He's approximately here, he said, tapping the chart. 270 nautical miles southeast of Norfolk Island. It was now after 8 p.m. local time. The sun had set. Darkness covered the Pacific, and Jay Prochnow had been flying for more than 20 hours. Cessna 771, Vette transmitted. We've calculated your approximate position. We're heading toward you now. But I need to know your fuel state. How much time do you have left? A pause. Then Jay's voice, quieter now, exhausted. I'm showing less than 30 minutes. Maybe 40 if I lean the mixture anymore. But the engine's already running rough. I don't think I can stretch it much further. 30 minutes. The DC-10 was still at least 45 minutes away. Even at maximum cruise speed, Vette felt the weight of those numbers. They'd narrowed the search area, established approximate position, done everything right. But the geometry was unforgiving. They were simply too far away. Unless they could give Jay a visual reference, something he could see, something he could navigate toward. Gordon, Vette said to Brooks, can we make a contrail? Brooks checked the outside air temperature gauge. We're at 35,000 feet. Temp is minus 50 Celsius. It's marginal. Contrails form when hot exhaust meets cold air with the right humidity. These conditions, I'd say 50-50. Not good enough, Vette muttered. Then another idea occurred to him. What if we dump fuel? Dovey turned to stare at him. Dump fuel? The DC-10 has fuel jettison capability. If we dump fuel at altitude, it'll vaporize and create a visible trail, like an artificial contrail. Jay might be able to see it. Brooks pulled out the aircraft systems manual, flipped to the fuel jettison section. We can dump up to 24,000 pounds through the wingtip nozzles. At altitude, with the right lighting conditions, it might create a visible vapor trail. But Captain, we're already calculating close margins on fuel for the return to Auckland. If we dump 24,000 pounds, how much can we dump and still make Auckland? Brooks ran the numbers. Safely? Maybe 5,000 pounds. Anything more and we'd have to divert to Norfolk ourselves. Vette considered. 5,000 pounds of jet fuel dumped at 35,000 feet vaporizing in the cold air. Would it be enough? Would Jay see it? Would the lighting conditions work? There was only one way to find out. Dump 5,000 pounds, Vette ordered. Brooks flipped switches, activated the fuel jettison system. Deep in the DC-10's wings, valves opened. Jet fuel began streaming from the wingtip nozzles, instantly vaporizing in the -50-degree air, creating twin white trails behind the aircraft. Cessna 771, Vette transmitted. We're dumping fuel to create a vapor trail. Look for a white trail in the sky like a contrail. If you see it, fly toward it. We'll be at the head of that trail. Silence on the radio. Then, I'm looking. I don't see anything. Wait, no, still nothing. The top of my canopy is kind of clouded. Makes it hard to look straight up. Minutes passed. The DC-10 continued its course, leaving twin white trails that faded into the darkness behind them. Still nothing, Jay reported. I'm sorry, I just can't see it. Vette closed the fuel dump valves. 5,000 pounds of fuel, vaporized into the night sky. It hadn't worked. They were running out of options. He checked his watch. 8:35 p.m. Sunset had occurred at approximately 7:15 p.m. But Jay, farther east, would have seen the sunset at a slightly different time. And that time difference could reveal his longitude. It was a technique used by mariners for centuries. Longitude is difficult to calculate without precise timekeeping. You need to know the exact moment of solar noon or sunset or sunrise and compare that to a reference point. But if you had multiple observers at different longitudes, all noting the exact time the sun touched the horizon, you could calculate the angular distance between them. Each degree of longitude corresponded to 4 minutes of clock time. If Jay saw the sunset at 7:22 p.m. and Norfolk Island recorded sunset at 7 p.m., that 22-minute difference meant Jay was 5.5 degrees east of Norfolk, roughly 290 nautical miles. Cessna 771, Vette transmitted, I need you to think back to when you saw the sunset. Do you remember the exact time? I wasn't really paying attention to sunset times. I was kind of focused on not running out of fuel. I understand. But this is important. Try to remember. When did you see the top of the sun touch the horizon? A long pause. Maybe 7:20? 7:25? Somewhere around there. Vette contacted Auckland Control, requested sunset time for Norfolk Island. The response came back, 7 p.m. local time. If Jay saw sunset at 7:22 p.m., that was a 22-minute difference. 22 minutes divided by 4 minutes per degree gave 5.5 degrees of longitude. At this latitude, that translated to approximately 290 nautical miles east of Norfolk Island. Combined with the earlier calculations placing Jay southwest of the DC-10's position and the VHF triangulation data, Vette now had a surprisingly precise fix on the Cessna's location. Cessna 771, Vette said, I'm calculating your position as approximately 290 nautical miles east-southeast of Norfolk Island. I'm going to give you a heading. Fly that heading and you should reach the island. What's the heading? 294 degrees magnetic. Fly 294 degrees. 294 degrees, Jay repeated. For how long? Vette did the math. At the Cessna's cruise speed of roughly 120 knots covering 290 miles would take about 2.5 hours. Jay didn't have 2.5 hours of fuel. But maybe, he had enough to get within range of Norfolk's beacon. If the ADF had failed due to a loose connection or a blown fuse, perhaps at closer range, with a stronger signal, it might work intermittently. It was a thin hope, but it was something. Just fly 294, Vette said. We're going to parallel your course. We'll stay with you. Roger. Heading 294. The DC-10 adjusted course, positioning itself north of Jay's track, flying parallel. From this position they could monitor his progress, provide updated headings if needed, coordinate with rescue services. Auckland Control had dispatched a P-3 Orion from the Royal New Zealand Air Force, a maritime patrol aircraft equipped with advanced search radar and long endurance. But the P-3 was hours away. By the time it arrived, Jay would either be on the ground at Norfolk or in the water. Vette made an announcement to the passenger cabin. The search was ongoing. They'd located the lost pilot, but the situation remained critical. Some passengers had been standing by the windows for hours, scanning the dark ocean below, hoping to catch a glimpse of the Cessna's lights. Others had come forward to the cockpit in small groups. Vette had invited them, wanting them to be part of the solution rather than simply waiting in seats. One of those passengers was Malcolm Forsyth, who'd identified himself as a navigator. He'd been plotting positions on a spare chart, double-checking Vette's calculations, offering suggestions. The cockpit had become a collaborative space, professional crew and volunteer navigator working together, using centuries-old techniques to solve a 21st-century problem. At 9:15 p.m., Jay's voice came over the radio, suddenly animated. I see lights on the water. What kind of lights? Vette asked immediately. Multiple lights. Looks like a ship? A large ship or maybe a platform? Vette contacted Auckland Control. Any ships in this area? Stand by. A pause. Then, we show an oil rig under tow, approximately 300 miles east of Norfolk Island. Could that be what he's seeing? Cessna 771, can you give me a description? It's definitely a platform of some kind. Multiple lights. It's big. That's an oil rig, Vette said. Auckland Control, can you contact that rig and get its exact position? Minutes passed. Then Auckland came back with coordinates. Vette plotted them on his chart. The oil rig was exactly where Jay should be, based on the sunset calculations. The geometry was holding. The math was working. Cessna 771, you're exactly where we calculated. Norfolk Island is approximately 150 nautical miles west-northwest of your current position. Adjust your heading to 296 degrees. You should reach the island in about 75 minutes. 75 minutes. Jay's fuel wouldn't last that long. But sometimes, when you're running on empty, the gauges lie. Fuel sloshes in tanks, gets trapped in corners, takes longer to burn than the instruments suggest. It's not reliable. It's not something you can count on. But sometimes, just sometimes, you get lucky. 296 degrees, Jay acknowledged. His voice sounded different now. Tired, yes. Strained, absolutely. But there was something else. A note of hope. Fragile but present. At 10:45 p.m., Jay transmitted, I think I see lights ahead. Faint, but yes, definitely lights. Could that be Norfolk? Vette checked the calculations. If Jay had maintained heading and airspeed, he should be within 40 miles of Norfolk now. Close enough to see the island's lights on a clear night. That should be Norfolk, Vette confirmed. You're almost there. The P-3 Orion arrived at 11 p.m., making radio contact, confirming radar contact with both the Cessna and the DC-10. The P-3 crew reported they'd established visual contact with the Cessna, a single set of navigation lights low over the water, heading steadily toward Norfolk Island. At 11:52 p.m., Jay Prochnow transmitted his final message to Air New Zealand Flight 103. I have the island in sight. I'm entering the traffic pattern, thank you. Thank you doesn't even begin to cover it, but thank you. Vette keyed his microphone one last time. You're welcome, Cessna 771. Now land that airplane and get some sleep. You've earned it. The DC-10 turned northwest toward Auckland. Vette contacted Norfolk Tower, confirming the Cessna was on approach. Then he sat back and allowed himself, finally, to feel the tension drain away. At 11:58 p.m. local time, December 22, 1978, Jay Prochnow touched down on Norfolk Island's runway. He'd been airborne for 23 hours and 5 minutes. The Cessna's fuel tanks contained nothing but vapor. When ground crew later measured the remaining fuel, they found less than 2 gallons, roughly 10 minutes of flying time. The engine quit 30 seconds after Jay shut it down. If he'd been forced to execute a go-around, if he'd needed to abort the landing and try again, The engine would have failed before he could climb back to pattern altitude. 10 minutes of fuel. That's what separated life from death. Air New Zealand Flight 103 landed in Auckland at 1:47 a.m. on December 23rd, more than 4 hours late. Not a single passenger complained. Several wrote letters to Air New Zealand praising the crew. One passenger, interviewed by a local newspaper, said, "We left on time for a 2-hour flight and arrived 4 hours late. It was the best flight of my life." Captain Gordon Vette never met Jay Prochnow face to face. The DC-10 proceeded to Auckland while Jay remained on Norfolk Island, recovering from the ordeal. But in 1980, the Guild of Air Pilots and Air Navigators awarded Vette the Johnston Memorial Trophy for outstanding air navigation. McDonnell Douglas, the manufacturer of the DC-10, sent a formal letter of recognition praising Vette for demonstrating the highest standard of compassion, judgment, and aerial excellence. The rescue became a case study in navigation schools, an example of how fundamental principles, geometry, astronomy, radio propagation, could be applied creatively in crisis situations. Before GPS, before satellite navigation, before digital everything, pilots and navigators had to understand the underlying science of position finding. Gordon Vette understood that science, and on a December night in 1978, that understanding saved a life. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the story isn't the technical brilliance, it's the choice. 88 passengers agreed to delay their Christmas travel to search for a stranger. A captain and crew volunteered to divert from their planned route, burn extra fuel, risk their own schedule. A navigator sitting in the passenger cabin stood up and offered to help. Ground controllers at Auckland coordinated resources, dispatched rescue aircraft, stayed on frequency for hours managing the search. No one had to help. The Cessna wasn't Air New Zealand's responsibility. Jay Prochnow wasn't their customer. There was no regulation requiring a commercial airliner to divert for a search and rescue mission. Every person involved could have said, "Not my problem, someone else will handle it." But they didn't. They chose to help because helping was the right thing to do. Because when someone is dying alone in the darkness, you don't calculate liability or measure convenience. You act. Gordon Vette, in interviews years later, was characteristically modest about the whole affair. "Any pilot with navigation training could have done what I did," he said. "The real heroes were the passengers who agreed to the delay. They're the ones who made it possible." But Malcolm Forsyth, the passenger navigator who spent hours in the cockpit helping with calculations, saw it differently. Gordon Vette took centuries-old navigation techniques, things mariners used before steam engines, before radio, and adapted them on the fly to find one tiny aircraft in an ocean the size of North America. He turned his hand into a sextant. He used the sunset to calculate longitude. He triangulated position using radio signal strength. It wasn't just skill, it was genius under pressure. The techniques Vette used that night are still taught today, not because modern pilots will need to measure the sun with their fists, GPS has made that obsolete, but because understanding the principles behind navigation makes you a better pilot. When technology fails, when the screens go dark and the satellites stop talking, you fall back on fundamentals. You fall back on science. And sometimes when everything goes wrong at the worst possible moment in the most unforgiving environment on Earth, those fundamentals are enough. Jay Prochnow completed his delivery flight to Australia after recovering on Norfolk Island. He returned to the United States, resumed his career, and by all accounts never ferried another aircraft across the Pacific. He rarely spoke publicly about the incident, preferring to let the story belong to the people who saved him rather than the person who was saved. Gordon Vette continued flying for Air New Zealand until his retirement. He became involved in aviation safety research, particularly investigating the 1979 Mount Erebus disaster in Antarctica. An Air New Zealand DC-10 that crashed into a mountainside, killing all 257 people aboard. Gordon Brooks, the flight engineer who'd been with Vette during the Cessna rescue, was killed in that crash. The loss affected Vette deeply. He spent years investigating the accident, ultimately challenging the official findings and helping to establish the real cause, a navigation error compounded by an optical illusion called sector whiteout. Vette passed away in August 2015 at the age of 82. His obituaries mentioned his role in the Erebus investigation, his decades of service with Air New Zealand, his contributions to aviation safety, Many also mentioned a December night in 1978 when he used his hands to measure the sun and turned an impossible search into an improbable rescue. The Pacific Ocean is still vast. It still swallows aircraft that stray too far from established routes. It's still unforgiving, still indifferent to human drama. But on December 21st and 22, 1978, for 23 hours and 5 minutes, that ocean was crossed by two aircraft, one massive, one tiny, connected by radio waves and human decency. And when the smaller aircraft finally touched down on solid ground, when Jay Prochnow shut down the engine and sat in the sudden silence of survival, he was not alone. He'd been accompanied every mile by voices in his headset, by strangers who became saviors, by people who looked at an impossible situation and decided to make it possible. That's the real story. Not the navigation techniques, as brilliant as they were. Not the geometric calculations or the sunset measurements or the VHF triangulation. The real story is simpler and more profound. When someone needed help, people helped. 88 passengers, 3 crew members, 1 passenger navigator, controllers on the ground. A P-3 Orion crew dispatched into the night. A community of people who could have looked away but chose instead to look harder. In a world that often feels fractured and cynical, where kindness can seem like weakness and helping strangers seems naive, that December night in 1978 offers a different model. It suggests that maybe, just maybe, our default setting as humans isn't indifference, but compassion. That when stripped of excuses and rationalizations, when confronted with a simple choice between helping and not helping, most people will choose to help. Gordon Vette's hand trick saved Jay Prochnow's life. But Gordon Vette's hand trick only worked because 88 people agreed to be late for Christmas. The science was brilliant. The humanity was what made it possible. And that, perhaps, is the lesson worth remembering. Not how to measure the sun with your fist, though that's a neat trick, but how to measure yourself when someone needs help. How to respond when you're the only one in range. How to choose compassion over convenience, action over apathy. On December 22, 1978, somewhere over the Pacific Ocean, 88 people made that choice, and 1 man lived because of it. The Cessna 188 Pacific Rescue remains one of the most remarkable examples of aerial navigation and human cooperation in aviation history. The techniques Captain Gordon Vette employed, using body measurements to estimate solar elevation, calculating position from sunset timing differences, and triangulating via VHF radio range, have been taught in navigation courses worldwide as demonstrations of fundamental principles applied under extreme pressure. In the decades since, GPS and modern avionics have made such scenarios less likely, but the core lesson endures. Technology serves those who understand the principles behind it, and no technology, however advanced, can replace the decision to help.